Most people do not realize that when a domestic adoption occurs, that a U.S. adoptee then has two birth certificates. They have an original birth certificate, which all of us in this theater have, and they also have a second birth certificate, an amended birth certificate. So this evening, I want to explain the differences between these two documents and the unique challenges that are faced by many adult adoptees today. And then I will explain a proposal that I have to change this very confusing, odd, and archaic system that exists today. So what do we use birth certificates for? We use it for identity. It tells who you are, when you were born, and where you were born. These birth certificates are used to enroll your child in school. If you're getting a Social Security card, you better have your birth certificate. When you're obtaining a driver's license or passport, if you're applying for college financial aid, they will request that. If you're applying for a marriage license, if you want to join the U.S. military, and more states are requiring them to register to vote for the first time. So, what is it with these two birth certificates? How different are they? The original birth certificate is what those of us in this theater have. It explains who gave birth to you. It lists the mother on your birth certificate, but it may or may not list the father. And that's because birth fathers were not given legal rights until the early 1970s by a U.S. Supreme Court ruling. So sometimes the space for father is blank. Sometimes it will list what's known as a legal father. And this could be someone who has absolutely no biological connection to the infant on the birth certificate. The legal father could be someone that the mother was married to several years ago, but now divorced from. A legal father could be a man in the military who's been overseas for a year, who obviously is not biologically related to this child. When an adoption occurs, a second birth certificate is then issued, and this is called an amended birth certificate. This certificate reads as if the adoptive parent or parents gave birth to this infant. And I want to repeat that. Those of you in genealogy, your head's probably spinning around right now. But the amended birth certificate reads as if the adoptive parents gave birth to this infant. Now, at the bottom of all the birth certificates, there's a signature for the Vital Records Registrar, and it has a date that that birth certificate was issued. On original birth certificates, that date is usually 2 or 3 days after the birth of this child. With an amended birth certificate, then that can be weeks, months, or even years later. And so that's causing some issues when you try to establish your identity. So when did this get so screwy? When did adult adoptees start having trouble proving who they are and getting their identity? I believe it all goes back to the U.S. Patriot Act. And this was the act that was enacted by Congress right after the terrorist attacks on the East Coast. And this was in the year 2001. And the Patriot Act initially was started so that money could not be funneled into terrorism. And it's an acronym. Some government workers spent a lot of time coming up with this one, I'm sure. So it stands for Uniting and Strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism. I love that. So the basic principle was to stop people from opening bank accounts and then funneling the money to terrorists. So in order to open a bank account, the banking industry set up parameters for establishing an identity. Through the years, that has kind of morphed by state governments into you have to prove your identity for several reasons now. And now in 2017, we frequently have to prove that we are who we say we are. As I mentioned, you have to submit a birth certificate for a passport application. Well, if you're an adoptee applying for a passport for the very first time and sending in your amended birth certificate, you have to sign the same statement that every US citizen has to get a passport. Warning, false statements made knowingly and willfully in passport applications, including affidavits or other documents submitted to support this application, are punishable by fine and/or imprisonment under US law, including the provisions of 18 USC 1001, 18 USC 1542, and/or 18 USC 1621. Well, it's no surprise that often the application that an adult adoptee makes is denied by the US Passport Office, and it is returned because the birth certificate looks odd, it looks fraudulent. And a lot of that goes back to the date that I mentioned on the bottom of the birth certificate, where it says when it was issued. So you're thinking, well, they have 2 birth certificates, why can't they just submit both of them with the passport application? Well, here's the kicker. Original birth certificates are available to adult adoptees without restrictions in only 9 states right now. That's Alabama, Alaska, Colorado, Hawaii is our most recent one added, Kansas, Maine, New Hampshire, Oregon, and Rhode Island. And even though you could obtain your original birth certificate if you were born in one of these 9 states, they do not agree on what constitutes an adult adoptee. In some states, like Kansas, it's 18. In some states, it's 21. And in some states, you have to wait till you're 25 before you can access your original birth certificate. So each state has their own rules and regulations for giving this original birth certificate. And in Kansas, and I like to warn adult adoptees about it because it can be jarring to see, you get the original birth certificate, and diagonally in bright red across the document, it reads void. And that is so this document cannot be used for fraudulent purposes. Some states, Missouri, for example, stamp for genealogical purposes only, not to be used for establishing identity. So 22 states, you will never be able to get your original birth certificate, period. It is not available to you. 19 states now have partial or access with restrictions. So what are some of those restrictions? And this is where the system appears really bizarre. Limits may include span of dates not allowed. In some states, if you were born prior to, for example, 1941, or born after 1961, yes, you can have your original birth certificate. But if you were born between 1941 and 1961, sorry, you're out of luck. Another restriction that is commonly used is that you have to prove both birth parents are deceased. Well, this can be difficult if you don't know whose names are on your original birth certificate. Another restriction, they require therapy from a certified therapist or social worker before we will release your original birth certificate to you. The next absurd one is one of my favorites, notarized permission from adoptive parents. So if you're 70 years old, you need notarized permission from your 90-something-year-old adoptive parents. Now, if one of those parents says no, then you don't get your original birth certificate. They both have to notarize that. Another restriction is to pay a court-approved confidential intermediary. The going rate right now is between $400 and $500. And they will ask your birth parents, they will find them, hopefully, and ask their permission to release the original birth certificate. Now, if the birth mother says yes and the birth father says no, you are out $400 to $500 and you will not get your original birth certificate. Another one of my favorite absurd things is if you are a step parent. Say you were born and brought up by one of your biological parents who then married another partner, and that partner adopted you. Well, some states will let you look at the original birth certificate. Still can't have it, but at least you can look at it. So how absurd can these situations be? Well, as you can imagine, they can get really weird. For example, and these are actual examples too, two tall, blue-eyed, blonde parents, adoptive parents, went to kindergarten roundup with their child. And this is, for those of us that are parents, this is a big deal when you can finally take your child to kindergarten roundup and enroll them for public school. So this couple went with their daughter, 5-year-old daughter, and the daughter is beautiful. She has big brown eyes and black hair, and she has dark skin. And so the parents explained to the school that, yes, this is our adopted daughter, and here is her birth certificate. And they present the amended birth certificate. And the school refuses to enroll this child for school because the signature at the bottom is dated 2 years after the birth. And so they do not believe this is really their child. Another example is a single male adopts a child, and the birth certificate, remember, reads as if this parent gave birth, except there's no woman on the birth certificate. So yeah, he has no hope of getting a passport. A widowed father remarries, and remarries a much younger woman. So the birth certificate then is changed when she adopts her husband's child. And on the amended birth certificate, it reads as if she gave birth to this child, but she was 7 years old at that time. So that looks odd. A mother was enrolling her child for soccer, and this is another instance where you have to show your birth certificate to document the age group. And the adoptive mother was listed as having lived in a certain city and state that she had never been to. And the person enrolling this child in soccer was from that particular city and state. Said, oh gosh, what high school did you go to? What part of the city did you live in? So she had to admit that she had never been there. She had no idea what the town was like. I talked to a genealogy group a few years ago, a state group, and afterwards a man came up and he said, can I tell you about my situation? And I said, absolutely. He grew up next door to a rather elderly woman, and this woman adored this man and had watched him grow up, and she didn't have any other family. And so she asked if he would be willing to help her with being the executor for the estate, and she would like to leave the house to him. So they went to an attorney, and the attorney said, well, why don't you just adopt him? So they did. The adoption occurred, and the vital statistics mailed the man his new birth certificate, which showed that the next door neighbor had given birth to him, and it was signed over 40 years after his birth. This poor guy has no hope of getting any government services. So what can we do? Here's my proposal. Let's eliminate these absurd amended birth certificates. I'd like to see them abolished. If you can stamp void across an original birth certificate, I think you can stamp certificate of adoption across an amended birth certificate. We need to quit pretending that the adoptive parents gave birth to this child. It's just absurd and it's causing problems. We need to archive the original birth certificate with the amended birth certificate, which we'll now call a certificate of adoption, together in the vital records department of each state. And when the parent of a minor child needs a birth certificate, she or he will contact Vital Stats and both documents will be sent. And we need to have more than 9 states. We need all 50 states to allow access to an original birth certificate at age 18. And a birth certificate is not just a simple piece of paper. A dear friend of mine and a New Jersey adult adoptee just had this profound statement that I love. and I want to end the talk with this. If birth certificates are not important, then why are they called vital records? Thank you for listening.